bands, part 4 of Led Zeppelin is provably the greatest rock and roll band in history. Not opinion, it's not subjective. It's a fact. So, for all you bored people, or you gluttons for punishment, who think it's the Who or the Doors or Queen or whoever else, it's not. They're all good. Oh man, I can listen to Queen all day, Black Sabbath, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, all of them, and I do. But I happen to know and acknowledge that Led Zeppelin are the greatest band. So here's another little fact about Led Zeppelin. And as you watch this video, it's 17 minutes. Okay. This is one of the album that the concert that broke them in America. It was so amazing, like no other concert in history. I don't think what happened to Led Zeppelin in Boston at the Boston Tea Party in January 1970, they just only had 2 albums out. Jesus, you know what? I think it was 1969 anyway. It will be mentioned in here. They were unknowns in America. Unknowns. There was a DJ in Boston that was pumping them up. Hey, Led Zeppelin's coming into town. It's a new UK band and they're really good. And this DJ was the one that really hyped them up. And a certain young man called Steve Tallarico, Italian, who became Steve Tyler, Aerosmith, was at that concert. And he, along with many other famous people, were crying at that concert for how amazing Led Zeppelin were. So keep in mind, while you think that it's the Doors, the monotonous, come on baby, light my fire, are the best, right? Because you are opinionated and you don't know facts. So as you watch this, just think of all the other musical acts before and after and ask yourself, has this ever happened before? Here we go. Enjoy.
This is a building that was once known as the Boston Tea Party, a legendary rock venue converted from an old synagogue. And it was here that Led Zeppelin played one of the most important gigs of their early years. Jimmy Page would later go on to say that this gig was the moment he knew they were actually going to make it. Of this gig, bass player John Paul Jones said this to the NME: "As far as I'm concerned, the key Zeppelin gig, the one that just put everything into focus, was the one that we played on our first American tour at the Boston Tea Party. Zeppelin seemed to consider this the show that broke America for them." As with much of Led Zeppelin history, this is an event that's kind of shrouded in rumour and a lot of hearsay. There are multiple different accounts that all differ just a little bit on the details. So today I've attempted to dig into whatever source material is available and to put it all together into one narrative, so that I can share with you the story of one of the wildest and most inspiring gigs of Led Zeppelin's early career. In January 1969, Led Zepp had only just released...
There you go. It was 1969. They only had one album that had only been released. It was released in January. They didn't even have an album. They didn't have an album. No one knew what they sounded like, and yet this happened.
It's their first album in the States, and it wouldn't even come out in the UK until a few months later. They were still all but unknown, Guitarist and band leader Jimmy Page did have some fame already, however, having been the guitarist for well-loved blues outfit the Yardbirds for a little while, a position that had also been filled by guitar greats Eric Clapton and Jeff Beck. The Yardbirds had played their last show together on July the 7th, 1968 at Luton College, after which they split, but they still had some outstanding tour dates. And so, out of the ashes, Jimmy Page put together a band, the New Yardbirds, that would become Led Zeppelin. They completed the last Yardbirds tour, came back to London, changed their name to Led Zepp, and went straight into the studio at the end of September to record their debut album, having worked all the material into shape on that tour. Now at this stage, Jimmy Page was relatively established and relatively famous. But they were still unsigned, and so they self-funded around 36 hours in Olympic Studios in London to record their first record.
Olympic Studios. Yeah? Mount Olympus and the gods of Olympus. How convenient that the greatest band in history would record at Olympic Studios. Pay attention. Oh no. I should be paying attention. This battery goes flat real quick. That's right, keep it running. Not a problem.
But by November, their manager, Peter Grant, had secured them a deal with Atlantic Records, one which was the biggest of its kind in history by that point, with an advance of £143,000. According to the Bank of England's website, that's equivalent to nearly £2 million today. So, by January 1969, the band Led Zeppelin had technically only really been in existence for about 4 months. In that time, they had self-funded an album, got a massive record deal, and gone out on tour in the States, all in quick succession. Led Zeppelin's debut album came out on the 12th of January 1969, stateside, and it received heavy advance radio airplay in the run-up to a gig in many of the areas in the US where they were due to perform. The big local FM radio station in Boston, WBCN, was playing the album round the clock in the run-up to the gig at the Boston Tea Party. What was actually going on behind the scenes with the radio was this. The band were booked for a run of gigs at the Boston Tea Party 4 nights in a row, Thursday to Sunday, the 23rd to the 26th of January 1969. And in a bit of a masterstroke move, the main rock radio station in Boston was actually based in and paired with that same venue. So, of course, it was in their interests to give Led Zeppelin heavy radio play in the run-up to the gig, because they stood to gain from it. Here's what Wikipedia says. In 1968, the first album rock FM station in Boston, WBCN, began broadcasting out of the back room of the Tea Party. WBCN was owned by the same owners as the Tea Party. So this was a very cleverly set up venue. Because it was not just a great place to play, it also basically had something of a monopoly in that area of the rock radio promotion market as well. For Jimmy Page, this run of gigs at the Tea Party with Zeppelin was his second time at the venue, having played there 9 months earlier with the Yardbirds. Both Peter Grant and Jimmy Page considered these to be crucial shows due to their location in one of America's most influential college towns and tremendous student population. Both were aware that when Fleetwood Mac arrived from London earlier in the year, they had been welcomed into the hearts of American youth with open arms, as had Jeff Beck soon after. Apparently, their run at the Tea Party was originally meant to be just a 3-night run, but this was expanded to 4. And it was on that 4th extra date that all magic happened. The band had already been touring around the States by the time of this run of gigs since December '68. Some gigs had gone well, others had not. In Detroit, for example, a reviewer in the first issue of Cream magazine noted, each member of the group was on a separate riff, not at all together. It was cringeworthy, but forgivable. So reviews from the critics were mixed. But the audiences were apparently loving it, and their reputation was spreading. A 20-year-old penniless New Yorker by the name of Stephen Tallarico had heard about the Tea Party gig and he was hitchhiking with his girlfriend to get there. He was friends with Henry Smith, who was roadieing for the gig, and who had agreed to get Stephen Tallarico into the gig for free if he could get to the venue. When he got there, having hitched all the way, there were hundreds of people queuing to get in. Bear in mind that this was a new band no one really knew yet. They weren't world famous, and their first release had only been out about 2 weeks. By this point, Zeppelin had already played their first 3 nights at the Boston Tea Party, all of which had gone down a storm, and this was their final gig in this run. Word of mouth in Boston had apparently reached fever pitch. Venue owner Don Law said, "We'd have a totally unknown British act open on Thursday, and there'd be lines down the street by Saturday." The Sunday night show was a sellout, with hundreds more squeezing in than should have. That venue was apparently legally allowed 700 people inside, but way exceeded that number on the night. The support band was called Raven, a band based out of Buffalo, New York, who would later that year tour the UK and be offered a record contract by George Harrison. And so, Stephen Tallarico, the hitchhiker, got to the gig, was let in by Henry Smith, and stood at the back of the packed room waiting for the concert to begin. "Praise Ye the Lord" was still written on the arch over the stage, harking back to the venue's days as a religious building. He waited for the main act to come on to see if reality could live up to the hype. He would not be disappointed. And so the main act began. The band were introduced by a DJ, presumably from that radio station that had been operating in the venue and promoting the gig. At the back of the hall, a door flung open, and the 4 musicians marched theatrically through the crowd like conquering heroes, parting the masses. "Here they are," Daniels roared, "from England. Let's give a warm Boston welcome to Led Zeppelin." The band played through their usual set, and reports vary as to how long it was, but everyone remembers it as being somewhere between 1 hour and 90 minutes. And the crowd went absolutely berserk. When Led Zeppelin launched into communication breakdown, the crowd was whipped into a trance state, heads bouncing, hands jerking, bodies flinging helter-skelter to the beat. The floor of the tea party resembled a tribal bacchanal. You could feel the whole building moving and shaking, recalled an Atlantic Records promotion man looking on. Now I'm going to play you a little clip from an alleged bootleg of that night, which most sources believe to actually be genuine, with a couple of edits. Now remember, this bootleg was recorded in 1969. No one had an iPhone in their pockets. I don't know, but I reckon this was probably recorded by the in-house radio station, who would have had access in the building to all that gear. Whoever was recording it had the mic very close to Jimmy Page's guitar amp, so it's a little bit out of whack. But here's a bit of that song, Communication Breakdown, from that gig. Have a listen. And the gig continued. The well-rehearsed arrangements lapsed into free-form jams riddled with improvisation. Dazed and confused segued into shapes of things, and Jimmy Page, imitating a hippie Merlin, pulled out a violin bow and sawed it across the strings of his guitar, getting sound and feedback that was as radical as anyone had heard since Jimi Hendrix. At this point, the room was borderline hysterical. Stephen Tallarico, the hitchhiker, burst into tears at the back of the hall during this song. And here's a bit of Jimmy Page's guitar bow magic from that gig as well. Pure theatrics. Led Zeppelin had started out on this, their first American tour, the way they intended to go on. 100% showmanship, in which every member of the band got to shine as a virtuoso. John Bonham also did a 5-minute drum solo, just using his hands. They also played How Many More Times, about which a reviewer for the Boston Phoenix wrote this: "For my taste, Led Zeppelin really get it together on How Many More Times, with which they like to close an evening. If you don't want to jump, dance and smile after hearing this, you must be dead." The wild, screaming reception accorded to Led Zeppelin certainly bears this feeling out. I expect them to be flying high for some time. And so, the band completed their first, approximately 90-minute set at the tea party. However, there was pandemonium at the end of the hour-long set. Led Zeppelin, spent and elated, took several bows and disappeared backstage while the crowd erupted in uncontainable ecstasy. A chorus of more, more, more persisted in the ballroom, picking up steam as each minute passed. It was clear they'd have to go out and play again, but they'd exhausted their repertoire. John Paul Jones said, "We've played our usual 1-hour set using all the material from the first album and Page's White Summer guitar piece, and by the end, the audience just wouldn't let us off the stage." When the band walked off for the first time that night, having played for their usual hour plus, the crowd was in such a frenzy that they were brought back out to play for another 12 encores in all that included several standing ovations, many in the middle of songs. The crowd had gone absolutely mental, and even the nastiest rock critics recognised this. John Landau, who also played a part in bringing about the end of the band Cream, described the Boston Tea Party as loud, violent, and often insane. Zeppelin were already exhausted at the end of a 4-night run in that same venue. Already having played the entire set through once, went back out and played the same set again, this time extending the solos and jam sessions. So now they had done 2 approximately 90-minute live sets. The band gave it everything they had. They looked as though they'd gone through a steam bath. A sweating Page and Bonham had stripped down to their vests, and Plant's tie-dyed t-shirt was soaked through to his chest. When they finished again, the reaction turned frightening. Applause gave way to stomping and thrashing. Fans began clambering onto the stage and yelling even more furiously for them to come back. "You've got to go back," John Law implored the band after they collapsed backstage. He had to be kidding. No way were they going to play that set again. After 5 minutes of unadulterated bedlam, however, they realised it was hopeless. They had to appease the crowd, if for no other reason than to settle them down. Otherwise, they were going to rip that place apart. A laughing, sweating Jimmy Page could only cough into his cigarette and ask the others, "What songs do you know?" If ever there was an East Coast breakthrough moment for Led Zeppelin, this was it. And so, having already performed for about 3 hours straight, Led Zeppelin went out and performed again. John Paul Jones said, "It was in such a state that we had to start throwing ideas around, just thinking of songs we all might know, or that some of us knew a part of, and work it from there. I mean, just anything that would come into our heads." And the response was quite amazing. There were kids actually bashing their heads against the stage. I've never seen that at a gig before or since. And this apparently happened during the song How Many More Times. Jimmy nudged John Paul during the encore performance of How Many More Times, just in time to witness the entire first row of boys smashing their heads against the edge of the stage. They performed rough approximations of Good Golly Miss Molly. Long Tall Sally segued into barely remembered old blues riffs they simply busked into something else. By the 4th hour they'd given up trying to do anything original at all, and were blasting out old hits by the Beatles, the Stones and the Who, and still the crowd stamped their feet and hollered for more, more, more. And so Led Zeppelin completed their 3rd full set of the evening, in which they played literally every last song any member of the band knew or could remember. And after that final set, they staggered backstage for the final time. Jimmy Page felt it. He later said that this was the moment he knew they were actually going to make it. After several months of going through the paces, playing a string of gigs in shitty little halls under abysmal circumstances, for what amounted to pocket change, Led Zeppelin had played themselves into hero status in Boston. John Paul Jones remembers, "Peter Grant was absolutely ecstatic. He was crying, if you can imagine that, and hugging us all. I suppose it was then that we realised just what Led Zeppelin was going to become." And now we come to the hitchhiker who had been there for the entire gig. Stephen Tallarico would change his name soon afterwards to Steven Tyler, and the next year he would begin to form his band, Aerosmith. Here's what he said about his experience at the Boston Tea Party 26 years later.
3 years later, in 1969, I saw Led Zeppelin perform at the Boston Tea Party. They ran out of songs after they played their whole first album, so they had to do a bunch of Elvis tunes because we wouldn't let them get off stage. I just sat cross-legged in the back of the room while they played the middle section of Dazed and Confused, and it was so fucking heavy that it made me cry. Another time I cried over Led Zeppelin was an hour later when Jimmy Page emerged from the dressing room with a beautiful girl in his arms. I would have been very impressed, except it was the girl I'd been living with up until that moment. But Jimmy was such a motherfucker on stage, I couldn't hold it against him.
And now we've come to the end of the story. And it just goes to show what can happen if bands and musicians persevere through rubbish gigs and negative reviews. If you're good enough, if you're lucky enough, if the timing is right, you too could experience a gig like this. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you next time.
Okay, so you heard about the ecstatic kids in the front banging their heads. Well, this is called headbanging music. You've heard it before. And according to history, or many historians, this is the first time it happened. Others will disagree. They will say it happened with Cream, I believe, but we're going to check that in a minute. So let's check that right now. The origin of the term headbanging is widely contested, though a popular anecdote attributes it to Led Zeppelin's 1968 or 1969 US tours. During performances at the Boston Tea Party venue, front row audience members were reportedly seen banging their heads against the stage in rhythm with the music, leading to the tone. However, linguistically, the term has earlier roots, with the Oxford Dictionary documenting usage as early as the 1880s. Okay. Key perspectives on its origins. The Led Zeppelin connection. Many sources cite the band's late 1960s concert as the moment the term was applied to the rhythmic head shaking observed in audiences. Linguistic roots, alternative claims. Several rock figures have laid claim to the term for the practice, including Lemmy Kilmister's Motorhead suggested the term might have derived from his band's name, Motorhead Banger. Dee Snider, Twisted Sister, claimed he originated the motion to get long hair out of his face, noting that Kick-Ass Monthly credited him and Angus Young in 1978. Ian Gillan once remarked that he might have invented it. Well, we don't know, but one thing we do know is that it happened on a night which I don't think happened to Paganini, Vivaldi, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Doors. If you know of any other band that has had to do 12 standing ovations, they had 12 standing ovations in between the songs, in the middle of the songs, people were standing up clapping, not at the end, and they had to do over 4 hours. Now, once George Harrison went to a Led Zeppelin concert, and he said to Robert Plant, who gave him a ticket, he said, when does the show start? He said, well, you just come at the start, and will be finished a couple hours. No, he asked, when is the intermission? And Robert Plant said, what intermission? He said, we'll be playing for 2 hours straight. He said, what? He said, when the Beatles toured, we were always booked for 20 minutes, and we only did 15 and walked off the stage. 15 minutes. Now why? This is the Beatles. 15 minutes, and no one said, how about
Encore?
an encore? Or how about doing the whole set again and again? So if you know of any other concert where that happened, please let me know, because I know for a fact that it's never happened before Led Zeppelin, and it's never happened after Led Zeppelin. Now, we know the Beatles dominated the 60s. That's a fact. It's indisputable. The Beatles owned the 60s. But when Led Zeppelin turned up, they kind of disappeared. Probably because they realised that the gods of music have turned up and their music shits on our music, so we'll just pack it up and leave the 70s for Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin is widely considered the band that owned the 1970s, reigning as the biggest rock act of the decade by breaking Beatles attendance records and defining the golden age of arena rock. They invented arena rock because they were so big and to sell out crowds. The Rolling Stones in the 70s never sold out one crowd, one arena. They were always playing to a quarter of an arena, and at the same time Led Zeppelin were touring at the same time as Led Zeppelin. In fact, in 1973, when they were doing their Houses of the Holy tour, and the Stones were doing their double album, their double album, Led Zeppelin were filling arenas and doing 1, 2, 3 shows a night, and the Stones were only getting a quarter of the arena full. So the Stones did not take over from the Beatles, but Led Zeppelin owned the best decade of music in history, arguably, the 70s. And there it is. While Led Zeppelin is often cited as the top, several other bands defined the sound and massive commercial success of the 1970s. Remember, it was Led Zeppelin that increased all the other bands' royalties from 2% to 7.33%. And they all followed suit. Till this day, every single musician since 1968 can thank Led Zeppelin for all the royalties that they make. Because otherwise, see, Led Zeppelin ended slavery of musicians. Like the troubadours and the travelling gypsies and all the musicians that would get pittance, and the promoters would be fat and rich and smoking cigars and eating caviar. Led Zeppelin changed that for all of you. All of you who think that Queen they are great, but they didn't do the unselfish thing that the Beatles did. Imagine how the Beatles and the Rolling Stones would feel when they worked their ass out in the 60s for 2% royalties, and then Led Zeppelin turns up, no one knows who they are, and they say, we want 7.3%. Imagine how they would have felt. We just did a whole decade top selling music and we only got that much for it. Why? Because they were selfish mofos. And Led Zeppelin were unselfish and saved the music industry. And because of them, royalties are now worth going touring and worth making albums. That's the greatest band, not rock band, in history. Because Beethoven didn't do it, neither did Prince, neither did Michael Jackson. Well, Led Zeppelin regarded as the undisputed champions of the decade, defining the era with a hammer of the gods sound. Pink Floyd released some of the best-selling and most influential albums, including Dark Side of the Moon and The Wall, two of my top 5 albums of all time. But there they are on top, guys. It wasn't Pink Floyd. It wasn't their decade. It was not Fleetwood Macs. It wasn't the Eagles. It was not the Bee Gees. It wasn't Queen. It wasn't Black Sabbath. It was Led Zeppelin. Key 70s achievements. There you go, Dark Side of the Moon, deservedly. Best-selling album of the 70s. Just sold 1 or 2 million more than Led Zeppelin 4. But they deserve it, because Pink Floyd are just too good. They're just too good. Top touring act of the 70s. And I'll finish with that, and I'll see you for part 5. Thank you for tuning in.